basketball, especially, and, you know, you go back a couple of decades, you blow out your knee, that was almost the kiss of death for you, right? You go back to the
Right, right.
70s, like that might be your career and you're selling cars or something like that. So we've definitely come a long way. But
Oh yeah.
in terms of recovery, like when you're working with these athletes, how long does it take, not just for them to get back into the game, right? Because it's one thing to, oh, he's putting on the uniform, he's going out there, but he's maybe 80 or 90%, right? Like, so there's the timeline for recovery. Is there an even longer timeline that you notice with knee injuries and basketball in particular for them to get back to their pre-injury form? Like, what does that kind of look like? Or is it everything is case dependent and depending on the athlete?
Oh man, you got the questions today, man. You got some really good questions. So I'm gonna hold on. That's a really good one. So personally, now this, I'm gonna be very honest here. I'll say it like it is. This really depends where you're at.
Mm-hmm.
When sport becomes a business, you're probably not coming back at 100%.
Mm-hmm.
I do work with professional athletes, and I try my best to not, if I have an input or a say, sometimes I do work with the organization kind of just in terms of communication and stuff, or even if they came to us privately. I do not think anybody should go back if they're not 100.
Mm-hmm.
Because that 10, 20%, there's the physical component and there's the mental component too.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't feel 100, even if like subjectively speaking to us, you know, you're doing what you're doing, you know, all the metrics and stuff, they're lining up to what you were before you got injured. Even if the athlete just does not feel like 100, I mean, we know Derrick Rose story. We know so many, right? Like, you have to, as a professional, as a trainer, I have to take that for what it is. Then you take longer to get back. Now, as I said, when it comes to professional sports, when the sport becomes about money, they're probably not going to come back at 100. But in my world, if you are in my space, I'll make sure that you don't go back until you're 100, because, you know, like, you got to prioritize your body. That's how you prioritize your career. You going back when you're less than 100 to prioritize maybe this season. Yeah. Right. But you got to think of longevity. You got to think of, are you putting yourself back into a situation where it's an increased risk of you re-aggravating whatever it is, you know, especially things like hamstrings, you know, things, you know, so certain injuries are quite finicky. Right. So personally, all my young guys, girls, you know, up until the pro level, it's pretty straightforward. The parents are very understanding. The athletes give me a little bit of a little back and forth sometimes, but because they want to play, right? Yeah. But I do not feel comfortable sending anybody back until I know once they step on the court, like they're good. Like they've been through full practices, they've built up to that, they've built up to full training regimen, full workload, full week, full everything for a bit of time, right? Yeah. And that also plays into the psychology, right? Because now they feel more comfortable. Like, you shouldn't really be getting out there until you've done everything that you've exposed yourself to all the demands that you will in a game, basically, right? The game has a bit of a unique component, which is the competition and the crowd sometimes and stuff. Like those things is very hard to emulate, like, you know, outside of that. But if that's all that's left, I think we're okay. Yeah. Well, you bring up such a good point too, right? Because there's the professional side of things, there's the youth side of things, but we're also seeing those worlds kind of blur a little bit there as well too, right? Like you've got some of these AAU teams that are playing 100, 150 games a year, and we're seeing an increase in knee injuries in athletes at younger and younger ages. Like if you go back to baseball years ago, they were having an epidemic of all of these kids blowing out their shoulders, blowing out their pitching arms, just because they were throwing way too much at way too young of an age. So they had to actually institute the innings cap limits for pitchers for Little League and all of that. Yep. Like, are you starting to see more of your athletes come to you with significant like ACL, MCL, tears, injuries like that at younger ages? And if so, like, do you think it's time for basketball to maybe even take a long, hard look in the mirror and say, like, maybe we institute a cap of, you know, yes, or something? Like, what are your thoughts there? Oh man, another great question. So just firing them out today. Oh man, you're ready today. So, okay. I would say it depends on the sport. As you mentioned, baseball is quite controlled now. Like I got a couple of pitchers I've worked with, and from little league all the way up, it's quite controlled. Basketball is far behind, especially when you consider, like you mentioned, AAU right now, which is creeping into our Canadian space as well. That was pretty slick how it crept in, right? Like that happened over just a couple of years, and all of a sudden now, you know, U12 kids are traveling 5 hours to play 6 games a day and all these crazy things. I would say, unfortunately, on the basketball side of things, we are not tracking things enough. We are not paying close enough attention to how much load, repetitive stress we are exposing these kids to. And then we could get into early sports specialization. That's a whole other rant as well. That definitely plays a part in it. What I would say though is, let's say if I'm so I train athletes exclusively one-on-one, right? If I work with a team, as you know, like Team Believe and stuff, everything is done on an individual basis. So they all get assessed individually and I train them individually. Now, when I work with athletes, this is part of the process. This is part of what I seriously consider and think about all the time is depending what age they're at, what type of competition they're in, how often they're playing every week, etc. We structure training in a certain way to make sure that they're developing physically as they're growing and in such a way that we're not overstressing the same structures. Because worst case scenario, and this happening, as you mentioned, this is happening a lot more often than it did when we were younger, which is worst case scenario, you know, a kid specializes in one sport when they're like 8 years old and they exclusively play that sport for a kind of a ridiculous amount of hours a week. And what you'll see is over the course of a couple of years, sometimes it doesn't even take that long, because all of a sudden now these kids are developing some pretty bad repetitive stress injuries that are not going away, right? Because these kids don't want to stop playing. And, you know, there's the pressure from the team. Well, we're traveling this weekend. We got 2 games. We need you to come out and play. And they're 12 years old, right? The body is going through its fastest rate of change at that time, right? So, you know, kids when they hit puberty, they're just kind of trying to figure out their body, right? Like they're awkward and stuff. So imagine during that time, you're exposing it to, you know, 500 pitches a week, right? Like, I don't know, a day or something, right? Or something crazy, or like 200 jumps in one game, right? Like that's a pretty bad equation, right? That's not going to end well for anybody. And to your point, I have noticed that, like, yes, we're getting some pretty ridiculously skilled kids getting into the NBA now, like some young guys that are showing some crazy talent, but a lot of them are not healthy. They're not. You know, they're 17 years old with terrible knees because of all the mileage.